Shana Tova. I was only a teenager, but I remember the scene like it was yesterday. I was walking down our street in Brooklyn, and my father turned to me and said, "Why can't you just be normal?" I had no idea how to answer him, even though this was not an unusual question for him. My normalcy was his ongoing quest. He could not, for the life of him, figure out why I hadn't turned out as he had expected me to. On one level was the fact that we lived in a traditional community and I didn't quite fit in. Many of you have heard my story. And for those of you who haven't, I grew up in Flatbush, Brooklyn, as part of an insular Syrian Jewish community with very specific and defined gender roles. I didn't wear the right clothes or jewelry. I wasn't skinny enough. I was a tomboy. And to make matters worse, by the end of high school, when I was supposed to be on my way to marriage at about age 17 or 18, I instead became passionate about living an independent life, about seeking adventure and exploring the world. I became determined to leave home and do something very radical, go to college. Something Syrian girls simply did not do. They stayed home and went to college like a couple of years at Brooklyn College most often. But there was a deeper level to this. It was more than my father just wanting me to fit in and project a certain image. There was a dimension that I didn't understand until much later, about my father's own internal chaos that made him desperate for normalcy. He grew up with a mother, my grandmother, who was mentally ill and attempted suicide several times. His own baby brother died of natural causes. He witnessed his younger sister being abused by his mother. And he grew up with terrible economic insecurity during the Depression. By the time I came around, my father had achieved some semblance of normalcy. He had financial success and stability. He was able to make a life for himself in the midst of the Syrian Jewish community, the only one of his 4 siblings who was able to do so. But when early on it became apparent that I did not fit in ways that he imagined I would, he saw the normalcy he had fought so hard for being destroyed. It made him feel so out of control, spiraling back towards his chaotic past, which of course meant that he couldn't see me as I was. He looked at me and heard the past. My father died in 2005. May his memory be blessed. It took me a long time to understand where he was coming from, but knowing about his background and learning more about it after his death was actually remarkable. My father started therapy when he was about 60. And after his death, his therapist came to me, this beautiful plant, and told me more about how my father suffered as a young child. That was such a gift. Perhaps it's against rules of privacy, I'm not sure. The therapist here will tell me, but it was such a gift. And I now have much forgiveness in my heart for my father, despite his inability to accept me or see me for who I was. And despite how much his non-acceptance hurt me. It's such a deep human need, isn't it? To be seen and accepted for who we are, to be beloved as we are. In the words of the 20th century writer Raymond Carver, and did you get what you wanted from this life? Even so, I did. And what did you want? To call myself beloved, to feel myself beloved on this earth. To call oneself beloved, one has to first be seen and heard. My question today on this Rosh Hashanah is, how can we hear and see each other more fully? Specifically, how might we keep our past from getting in the way of being more fully present to each other, of being more fully present to the present? Let's turn to the harrowing, mysterious narrative that is our Torah reading this morning. When Abraham hears the divine call to offer up his son, his beloved son, where is he? Is he fully present? And what is he present to? Or is he still hearing voices from his own haunted past? I want to suggest that when Abraham hears God telling him to sacrifice his son, he misunderstood. He got it all wrong. I know this may seem like heresy for a yeshiva girl from Brooklyn. I could just hear my father getting upset. Abraham, get it wrong? How dare you? But I'm actually, believe it or not, following the reading of Rashi, the 11th century commentator, whose commentary guides the most traditional readings of Torah, and is itself based on commentary of the ancient rabbis, the classical midrash. In his commentary on God's command in verse 2 of chapter 22, take your son, your only one, Yitzchak, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and more specifically the words, V'ha'alehu sham le'olah, and offer him up for a burnt offering. And Allah, Rashi says, God did not say slay him, because the Holy One, blessed be he, did not desire that he should slay him. But he told him to bring him up to the mountain, to make of him a burnt offering. And once he had taken him up, God said to him, bring him down. If you've ever read Genesis 22, the story of the binding of Isaac, this interpretation sounds way off, like a huge apologetic for God. It transforms what seems like a brutal God into a fairly nice God, when the text seems to be clearly saying that God told Abraham to sacrifice, meaning kill Isaac. Could it be that the command to kill his son was only in Abraham's mind? Here's where I think Rashi is drawing his interpretation. The word for burnt offering, olah, can be construed, or is actually a noun for just going up. And there's a really interesting literary connection to yesterday's prophetic reading from Samuel 1, where Hannah prays for a child and is giving Samuel. And at the end of chapter 1 in Samuel 1, it says, she takes him up. And it uses the word na'ar, which very much links us to our story today, to the binding of Isaac. It uses the word na'ar. It says she takes him up. It says that several times. And she takes him up and she sacrifices, meaning she kills a bull. So there's another story in which we can understand going up, or olah, as simply going up and raising up his son. Given that we have another model for how to possibly hear the word olah, then we can imagine that Abraham had a choice in how to interpret God's words. But Abraham hears the divine voice through a specific prism. He interprets it. And of course, we all interpret what we hear. We listen through our own prisms, our own particularity. So what's Abraham's prism? What is he hearing? To find out, we need to go to Abraham's beginnings, to his early life. We're not told very much in the Torah, but one thing that's noticeably absent is a mother, right? There's at the end of Genesis 11, In the genealogy where we first meet Abraham, who's then Avram, no mother is mentioned. So we might imagine, given this, that he didn't experience maternal love. Secondly, his father, Terach, we are told in Genesis, at the end of Genesis 11 also, that Terach dies, and this happens before Abraham gets the call. But Terach is 145 when he dies, which means that after Avram leaves home, he lives for another 70 years, but they never have contact, right? There's complete cutoff of contact. He could have been at, Isaac's weaning party, but he was not. I think the Torah is subtly indicating that parenting was missing for Abraham, right? There was no intimacy in his early life. And then the Midrash elaborates on these textual clues, and they construct a whole mythology about when Abraham was born. At the time of the pregnancy of his mother, there were these astrologers who foretold his birth to King Nimrod, and the astrologers said, this man will destroy your faith and your religion, right? And sort of take away everything that you're standing for. So when Abraham's mother was pregnant, Terach wanted to take her and deliver her to Nimrod so Nimrod could kill her baby, because he had made this edict where he said, all baby boys shall die at the hands of midwives, just like Pharaoh does later in the book of Exodus. So what Abraham's mother does when she's pregnant to hide from her own husband is go into a cave and give birth to Abraham, and then she abandons him there because she knew that he would be killed. And then God had angels go and protect him and care for him until he grew up. But the famous story in the Midrash is the story about Terach, who had a shop, a store of idols. And Abraham did not believe in his father's idols. And while his father was out of the house one day or out of the shop one day, he took a club and he destroyed all the idols. And Terach was so mad. And what did he do according to the Midrash? He delivered Abraham to Nimrod. And Nimrod threw him into a fiery furnace, and a miracle happened, and God protected him, and Abraham came out of the fiery furnace alive. Aviva Zornberg, the great scholar of biblical literature, says that Terach delivering Abraham to Nimrod was an unsuccessful attempt to murder his son. It was a near-death experience for Abraham in which he is delivered by God. Given this reading, it is no wonder that Abraham's little capacity to understand family relationships. No wonder Abraham cannot be present for his wife or children. He barely survives his early years. It makes sense then that when Abraham hears the voice of God ask him to raise up his son, he hears slaughter. He hears kill. Because that's what his father tried to do to him. That's his early imprint. He hears destroy Isaac, despite God promising him that his children will be as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sands of the seashore. Hearing the divine promise was nothing to the early imprint of having a murderous father. I can't help but think, when I read the story of my own father, with much greater compassion than I once was able to summon. Having an abusive mother, having suffered multiple tragedies and traumas, my father could not hear or see what was before him. The past was a barrier to the reality of the present. Abraham, too, is looking at his child and hearing the past, until, that is, a conversation with Isaac shows him another path. This conversation in the middle of the Akedah is one of the most intimate conversations in all of biblical literature. It starts with Isaac saying, Avi, my father, daddy. Abraham responds, Hineni bini, I am here for you, my son. Maybe for the first time, Abraham is there for his son. His heart has softened. He sees his son bearing the wood, the means of his own binding and slaughter, and he softens. Whereas until now, he has only been there for God, now he is present for his child. Yitzchak, Isaac, continues to ask the most heartbreaking of questions. Hinei ha'esh v'ha'itzim v'ayeh haseh le'olah. Here are the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the offering up? What could Abraham have been thinking at that moment? How can he bear to be present for God as he understood God, and also for his son at that very same moment? He couldn't. Given his interpretation of God's words, it was impossible to do both. He had to choose one. Either he will continue to be frozen in the past, or he will soften to the present. How can Abraham answer his son's question? He answers Isaac's question with an impossible sense of faith. God will see to the sheep for his burnt offering, my son. Elohim yir'elo haseh le'olah b'ni. Let's consider for a moment who this God is in the Akedah. We start off the story with the God of judgment, Elohim. But in a moment in the story, we're about to meet Malach Adonai, the Malach of Yud-Heh Vav-Heh. We start off with judgment in a world that's ordered, like in Genesis, right? Nothing's messing it up, right? Light, dark, heaven, earth, wet, dry. But the God of Yud-Heh Vav-Heh, introduced in Genesis 2, is the God of human messiness. Once humans come on the scene and God interacts with them, we need Yud-Heh Vav-Heh, the God of intimacy, the God of compassion, the God of, again, the human mess. So I think when Abraham softens, he's able to hear, even in the midst of his picking up the knife and being about to sacrifice his son, he hears the angel of Yud-Heh Vav-Heh say, Abraham, Abraham, put down that knife. Don't do anything to your son. Don't touch him. It's a sea change. And in fact, the Torah scroll indicates this because there's a pasek, there's a line between one Abraham and another Abraham. And the Zohar tells us that one Abraham is different than the other Abraham. The Abraham who believed in the God of judgment and justice and allowed him to be a hero on the world stage has now receded, and Malach Adonai speaking softly, telling him to put the knife down. That's the Abraham. That's the aspect of God that Abraham can hear now. There are three Hinenis in this story, right? Three Hinenis in quickest succession in all biblical literature. The first Hineni is to the God of judgment, to Elohim. The second Hineni is to his son. And the third Hineni, to Malach Yud-Heh Vav-Heh, is the Hineni that brings it all together, that integrates Abraham of God and Abraham in the family realm. Abraham that can withstand the messiness of human relationships with compassion. To come full circle, my father could not tolerate how deeply disordered his world was. He was desperate for order. In a sense, he was desperate for the God of judgment. And he thought he relied on me to restore order to the world, but unfortunately, I did the opposite. In a sense, one could say he heard only Elohim's voice, the God of judgment, because the mess of the world was just too chaotic for him, too painful for him, given his past. He could not tolerate the God of compassion, the God that might allow him to let go of the past. But the truth is, and my husband reminded me of this recently while he was reading, when he read this sermon, that there were some subtle changes and shifts in my father over time. I'll never forget when he came to my senior sermon, which was a rite that all rabbinical students at JTS have to go through. And then it was on a Shabbat morning, and my parents came. It was the first time he walked into a non-Orthodox synagogue with men and women sitting together, and a woman, his daughter, giving a sermon at the front of the room. And my husband sat next to him, and he's like, he couldn't believe how full of wonder my father was. And afterwards, my father told me it was the most spiritual day of his entire life. So he was also called, parts of him, new parts of him were called into existence by something new, by some new way of relating. So where does that leave us? I think it leaves us in the mess of compassion. Meaning it is in the mess of the divine field of Yud-He Vav-He, which is constantly disrupted and damaged by humans. God is ever disappointed and enraged at who and how human beings are in the Torah, but God stays in the field. And that is the field in which forgiveness and compassion is born. Can we tolerate this mess, these messy human relationships? And be present to one another, to ourselves, moving away from the order of judgment? On this day, we will soon blow the shofar whose purpose is, or one of its purposes, is to arouse God's compassion for us. We ask God to tolerate the mess that we are and accept us. Hear us just as we are and where we are, and respond to us as God's beloved children. I pray that in the coming year, we adopt a practice of seeing and hearing each other as we are and where we are, which means letting go of the past and being present, which means saying, Hineni, Hineni. May we be acceptable to the divine and to one another on this day of judgment. May we call ourselves and one another beloved. May we feel ourselves beloved on this earth. Shana Tova.
Chazak u'baruch.